Hello, it's Erica, the founder of Pocketboard, a marketplace where you can find a mentor who will share their expertise with you to help you navigate your current professional goals. Today, I'm sitting down with staff technical product manager Quy L to get the inside scoop on what it takes to be successful as an API product manager. Quy is a seasoned product manager with over 15 years of experience building products at a lot of companies you've probably heard of. And today he's joining us to share the secret sauce of API product management. Today is going to be jam-packed full of information. We're going to start with all about APIs. What are they? How should you think about them as a product manager, as a user? We're going to talk about what API product managers do and how they measure success in their roles. We're going to talk about some common pitfalls that people fall into as API product managers. And then we're going to talk about how you can break into API product management. Stick around till the end, and Quy is going to give you his top 3 tips on landing your first API product management job. Quy, all right, I'd like to hand it over to you to introduce yourself.
Great, thanks, Erica. My name is Quy. I'm currently a product manager at Segment. And Segment is actually part of Twilio. In my past experience, I've been the lead API product manager at Yelp, as well as Braintree, which is currently part of PayPal. I've also been a former software developer, so not only do I have experience being a product manager of API platforms, but I have experience actually developing APIs.
Do you think it's important that a product manager in API product management has the experience of being a software engineer?
You do not need to have technical experience to be an API product manager.
What do you think is a fun, interesting fact about APIs that most people listening have probably never heard?
One of the things that I think would be interesting to know is what are the most popular public APIs out there? A company called Postman, they've done a survey, and in their survey, they asked their developers, what are the most popular APIs that you use? And according to their survey, the top 5 are first, number 1, Salesforce. It's not surprising. Number 2 is Twitter, though I have a sneaking suspicion that ranking may go down, understanding what's Twitter going through right now. Number 3 is Notion. It's a note-taking platform. Number 4 is Microsoft Graph, and number 5 is Slack.
We're not going to get into a rabbit hole about Twitter, but I think it's healthy to acknowledge for all of the tweets in our lives that it's been tough times for Twitter recently, and for Twitter product people, Twitter software engineers. So just sending love. But one thing that really stood out to me about that list was Notion.
Yeah.
Notion is a relatively young product. They're less than 5 years old, and they're in a pretty competitive space, note-taking documents. What do you think it is about Notion, their product strategy, that would make them third on this list?
Notion is up there, same thing with Slack. And I think of Notion and Slack as productivity tools when it comes to work. I haven't looked at Notion, but my suspicion is maybe the API is really simple and easy to use. Or maybe their core product, Notion, is very simple, but people want to do more with Notion. So they're using the API to support more of their different use cases that Notion can't support today.
Let's dive into it. Can you start by explaining what an API is?
Yeah, it's a good question. First and foremost, for people who don't know, API is actually an acronym. It stands for Application Programming Interface. So let me first explain it in layman's terms. Just how would you explain it to someone who is non-technical and knows nothing about APIs? You can think of an API as a way for you to give instruction to someone, and then that someone will perform this action. And the best example here is just going to a restaurant, right? If you go to a restaurant and you want to order food, the first thing you do is get a menu, right? You look over the menu, you tell the waiter what your food order is, and then the waiter goes to the kitchen and they respond with your food, the food that you ordered. And that's what basically what an API is, right? You give instructions to something and then you get a response back. In this example, right, the menu is basically the API, right? The API is a list of ingredients, a list of, in this case, food items that you want to order. The instruction that you're giving is basically you instructing the waiter, in this case, to like place an order with the kitchen, and then an API returns something, right? You tell an API, this is what I want, and then the API responds with something. In this case, you're telling the waiter, hey, you're giving instruction to the waiter to order food, and then what the API is responding to, in this case, the kitchen, is responding with the food that you ordered. So in a nutshell, that's basically what API is, a way for you to request something and then you get something back.
What Quy just gave you is a piece of interview gold. I teach a lot of people how to explain APIs in layman terms. And this restaurant example is such a clear, approachable, consistent way of explaining APIs. So for those who are listening because they want to hear how to get into API product management, keep track of that metaphor that Quy just gave you because it will help you as you go through the interview process. Let's say we have some folks that are listening who are like, okay, yeah, no, I understand the restaurant analogy, but like, what is really happening behind the scenes? Can you explain it maybe in a slightly more technical lens as well?
You can think of API as a piece of technology that allows two systems to talk to each other. I'm just going to keep kind of using the restaurant metaphor, but in this case, let's assume that I'm building a travel website or a travel mobile application. And as part of the travel website, I want to list like the best restaurants in San Francisco. I want to use a Yelp API, and I'm just using Yelp because that's near and dear to my heart. I used to work at Yelp. So I'm building this travel website and I want to use Yelp's API to list the best restaurants in San Francisco, sorted by Yelp reviews. So what's happening there is the Yelp API exposes a list of what we call endpoints. They're just different API calls that you can make. And behind the scenes, what you're doing is you're taking what we call the endpoint or the URL of the endpoint, and you're passing a bunch of instructions. These instructions are actually like request parameters. So you're telling the Yelp search API, I want a list of restaurants. Because you're using a search API, it will do the search for you. But what you're sending are parameters on your criteria. So in this case, the Yelp search API needs like latitude, longitude. You can also pass in the cuisines if you want the best Italian restaurants. You can do that. Italian restaurants sorted by Yelp reviews. So those are basically the input parameters. And what the Yelp API will do is take what they call the payload, the input parameters. It's going to send it over your standard HTTP protocols and then send you a response back. And in technical terms, the response back is just a bunch of data called payload. And for people who are more technical, typically an API response is in JSON format. So when you get that response back to your website that's making the call, you take the JSON payload, you parse it, you extract the information that you need, and then you can show that information on the said travel website mobile app that you're making. So that's basically it in technical terms. And in making the API call, like any programming language can make an API call. So whether you're using like PHP or JavaScript or Java, yeah, you can use any language. And most public API platforms also have SDK. So, it takes some time to like actually make an API call with your programming language, but a lot of API platform providers offer you an SDK where they kind of like collect a bunch of helper functions where you can easily make these calls very quickly.
What are the different types of APIs? What are the different use cases? And then how are those grouped into categories of APIs that I can make sense of?
The most common form API that you and I are aware of are just the public APIs that any developer can use. And these type of APIs are APIs like I mentioned, Yelp or Slack or Facebook or Twitter. And you can simply sign up for free and use the API. In some instances, you can sign up for free, but the public API is limited. If you want to use more of the API, you can pay more for like more usage or more traffic that you want to send to these APIs. So first thing is a public API. Anyone can use it. Anyone can sign up. Most often they're free. The second set of APIs are APIs that you don't know, right? These are private APIs, and these APIs are really internal APIs that are used within companies and organizations. So like these internal APIs are really used by the engineering teams of companies to actually power their platforms, their products and features. You hear like a lot about microservices, and those are kind of like the private APIs that are used by these companies. So those are private. You'll never see them. It's only engineering teams that companies will use them. And last but not least, there's something called partner API. So partner APIs is kind of like a public API, but partner APIs are only offered for certain partners or developers who, let's say, have signed a contract to use a partner API. One example is, let's say you have a hospital and insurance company. They kind of have a contract together where a hospital can use an API to process like insurance claims. Another example of partner API, just from my experience, is Yelp has something called a Yelp advertising API. And this advertising API actually allows you to generate money off of Yelp advertising, but we don't offer it to anyone. You actually have to go through a biz dev team and sign a contract. And as soon as you sign a contract with our biz dev team, then we give you a set of special keys to use the Yelp advertising API. And that's another example of a partner API.
So basically there's, 3 levels of access. There's internal only, total public access, and then access if we invite you types of
Right.
APIs. But fundamentally, they're all using the exact same technologies. They've got get, post, delete. The fundamental way you build these is not different. It's just the way you control access to them.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. But one thing to keep in mind is that private APIs are not very strict between securities sometimes, because a lot of these private APIs are behind the company's firewall. So you don't have to worry too much about like security because it's behind the firewall, but especially public and partner APIs, you have to be really strict about security and authentication because that's kind of open and wide to the public. So you have to be very careful about who gets access and what they can do.
That is a great segue to my next question, which is what are API product managers fundamentally responsible for? You're talking about security here, but also, maybe you can walk through the core responsibilities.
When you're responsible for an API product, what does that really mean? 3 things: the core API platform, the developer experience, thirdly, the SDKs. There's many levels of things you have to worry about when you're building an API. One is just first and foremost the core API, right? I talked about earlier the Yelp API, the many different endpoints. So you're responsible for all the APIs and the endpoints. You are also responsible for their developer experience. And what I mean by developer experience is how they interact with your API. Like how do they sign up for your API? How do they understand how your API works? So that's a documentation, as well as like what's changing API, like release notes. So it's not just the product itself as API, it's just the experience around it. And then last but not least, SDKs.
One thing you didn't talk about is UI or wireframing. If someone listening is trying to decide, do I want to be an API PM or to be another type of PM? What type of person would be more interested in API product management?
As an API product manager, you don't traditionally work with product designers because you're not building something that a consumer sees and touches, right? You're actually building for developers. You really do have to think about UI, UX, both from a developer experience point of view, but also kind of a second level where you have to think about what kind of experiences do you want to build for consumers, but you giving this power or toolkit to developers. It's one thing to like build a consumer facing product that has UI in front of it, UX. For people who are listening, if you are, technical, but you also want to use some of your creativity, hey, I'm going to build this toolkit for developers and kind of imagine what are the types of things they actually would build for consumers. API product managers do work with UI, UX in terms of developer experience. Developer experience is a whole nother discipline where you really have to understand how developers actually use and interact with your APIs.
So it's not about UI versus no UI. It's about how excited are you to empower developers to get really creative about how to use this product and to unleash their ability to use all of the data and the capabilities of the product in new and creative ways.
That's one of the reasons why I love being an API product manager, because I see developers do some really cool things with APIs, and I just see new things, almost every day.
We always talk about North Star metrics when we talk about product management. So what are some of the common KPIs and North Star metrics that API PMs track?
Yeah, so I think one thing about KPIs, I kind of think about it in kind of 2 things. There's product KPIs and there's the infrastructure. So let me just start with product KPIs. In my past experience, some of the common KPIs that I've looked at is how many signups am I getting from an API? You kind of think of it as a conversion funnel. The second thing is once they signed up, how long does it take for them to actually make the first API call? And that's kind of the classic time to first hello world. It's like your API isn't useful until a developer actually makes the first API call, and it could be the first meaningful API call. If you're like developing a payments API like a Braintree or PayPal, the first meaningful API call is not list the users, right? The first meaningful API call is the first transaction that you use to actually process a payment. And that's what you call an activation metric. Third, a health metric is how well is your API is doing. With any consumer product, you look at like daily active users, monthly active users. Same thing for APIs. what is your daily and monthly active developers, right? Because at the end of the day, the people who are using your product are developers. So it's really the number of active developers that are using your API. A few other things, support, like if your API is doing well, then you want to track support tickets. And last but not least, if you're building an API that generates revenue, definitely looking at revenue, right? When I was at Yelp, one of our big KPIs is the amount of revenue that was generated by Yelp's advertising API. So those are kind of like product KPIs. The second thing to think of, and this is really more engineering led, really about the platform of your APIs. How well is your APIs doing in terms of performance and reliability? So like, what is the error rate of your APIs? What is the percentage of errors they get when they try to make an API call? And the second thing is uptime, right? An API at the end of the day is a platform feature. So is it available, reliable? And then last but not least, is it responsive, right? When you make an API call, in order to have a good experience for developers, do the APIs respond very, very fast in milliseconds, right? Like 50 milliseconds, 100 milliseconds, because at the end of the day, uh, developers are using your APIs to power their experiences. And if your API is really slow, then the consumers who are using their products and features are going to have a bad experience.
So we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, and you said, hey, API product managers do not have to have a software engineering background. My question for you is, how technical do you think an API product manager needs to be, and technical in what ways to be successful?
It goes without saying, if you do have a technical background, it will definitely help you, but it is not necessary. So there are tools out there, Postman, for example, where you can actually just enter an API input URL, type in a bunch of parameters, hit submit, and it'll just make an API call and return API calls. I actually use those tools myself. So I don't have time to actually like open a terminal, write some code, and make an API call. So I think understanding the basics of APIs first and foremost, and there's tools out there for you to actually make API calls yourself. The second thing is if you have a good product management foundation to understand what the value is and what the problems are around APIs, I think that's really important too, because at the end of the day, any API is just like another product. And you want to make sure that you're building the right product to deliver the most value for your customers, in this case, for the developer. Last but not least, I think being able to work with your engineering teams, having good collaboration, you're not going to know everything, but if you're able to ask the right questions to the engineering team and be curious, I think that's good enough, because you can leave most of the complex technical bits to your engineering team, but you should be able to ask the right questions.
The most important thing to be an API product manager is not being able to code or having coded in the past. I'm sure that's very good news for some of the listeners, because it's a part of product management that isn't talked about very much. What are the different pathways to get into API product management roles?
I think there's many paths to become an API product manager. One easy path is you're already a product manager. Let's say I mentioned like a consumer product manager, kind of move like horizontally. That's kind of one way. But let's pretend you're not a product manager, right? You want to become an API product manager and jump directly in. I've seen a few paths. I used to be a software developer myself. Yeah, if you're an engineer, you already have the technical foundation. And the next step is just to develop more product sense. If you can develop that product sense and understand customer value and problems, you can easily transition to an API product manager. A few other roles that I've seen where they were successful in being an API product manager is developer advocates or evangelists. And these are the people who are kind of on the ground, like actually talking to developers and users of the API. So they actually understand like the customers and users and the customer problems. And last but not least, I've also seen technical writers who have I worked with in developing documentation to help build a good developer experience.
We could probably do a whole episode just on, first of all, how you get each of those roles, and then like the actual roadmap to getting into product management. But we'll hold that for your mentoring sessions. If you're interested in getting into API product management, you should consider sitting down and actually having a one-on-one chat with Quy, where he can help you kind of put together that roadmap and start to build that case for moving into API product management. So let's just fast forward, assume that I've had these sessions with you and I'm actually getting the opportunity to move into an API product management role. What are your top 3 tips on being successful as an API PM?
These tips are very much aligned with just tips in being just a good product manager, but I'm just kind of apply a API product management lens to it. The first thing is really understanding your domain, right? What I mean by that is being an API product manager, you really need to know a little bit about APIs and what APIs can and can't do, and be able to just make an API call yourself. And like I mentioned before, you don't have to code to make API calls. Just use a tool like Postman and just make those calls yourself. The second thing is really understanding like what a good experience looks like when it comes to APIs. It's about developer experience, onboarding, signing up for APIs. What does good documentation look like? How do they test your API? Things like that. And last but not least, understanding what APIs can bring to the table for the company that you're working for. So really understanding the customer use cases and the problems that they have with any product. Really have to understand what the customer's pain points in order to build the right product for them.
What are the top three pitfalls and how do I avoid them?
I think some of the pitfalls is really about making sure that the onboarding experience is seamless and frictionless. Because you can have the best API in the world, but if people cannot figure out what your API does, they can't figure out how to sign up for your API and they can't figure out how to test it, they're never going to be able to know the true value of your API. One of the rules that I've read about is 333 rule. When a developer comes to your website, they have to understand in 3 seconds, what is the purpose of your API? What can it do for me, right? That's 3. Once they understand that, can they sign up for your API in less than 30 seconds? So that's 30. And then the last 3 is, can I make my first API call in under 3 minutes? So that's 333. I don't know if all API platforms can kind of fall under that, but I think that's what you should strive for.
One of the things that you have had the privilege to do in your career that many API product managers would aspire to be able to do is actually building a successful API program within a company from soup to nuts.
In order to build a successful API program at any company, you really have to be set up for success. And what I mean by that is you're going to have not just your engineering team to kind of build API. You need to have a good support structure. First and foremost, you're going to have a solid engineering team. First and foremost, build your core APIs for the developer. Second, it needs to build a good developer experience, which means onboarding and documentation. Thirdly, you need SDKs at the end of the day. In my past experiences, I've had those 3 key teams: core API platform, a developer experience team, and an SDK team. That could be one team, or it could be 3 separate teams. Once you have your API out there, how do you market and promote your APIs? How do you support your APIs? So the other 2 teams that is definitely needed is a developer relations team, advocates who are actually talking to these developers, but also they kind of go out there and like do webinars, go to conferences, they help run hackathons, right? They gotta generate interest and excitement about your APIs, kind of that marketing muscle to get your APIs out there. Last but not least, you need a good support team, right? Whether it's API support, email support, your documentation can never be perfect, right? There's always going to be things that developers can't figure out. So there needs to be a way for developers to get support for your API. One thing I do want to call out is you really need to have the support of like stakeholders at the top. If you work for a developer first company like a Twilio or Stripe or PayPal, I think getting that buy-in from the top is pretty easy. If you don't have that buy-in, then you really have to build a business case for it to say, hey, we need this API to deliver this value. Make sure you're doing your customer research to say, hey, these are actual pain points or problems that customers want. And we can't build this as part of a core platform, but if you build these APIs, then you can empower your customers, developers to build these things.
One of the things that you shared with me before we actually started recording this was this concept from Amazon around making sure that all services have an interface.
APIs were not a thing like 20 years ago. Like no one knew what API was, but I think one of the very first successful API programs was actually from Amazon. Everyone uses Amazon AWS services today, but the origin of that was back in 2002. So he sent like a legendary like API manifesto or memo, and I'm going to just paraphrase it right now. But basically he said, all these interfaces that you're building for each team, you have to make it external and build it from the ground up. Each team should build interfaces around these services and be able to expose it not to just to their internal team, but design in such a way where you can expose these services to the world. The last statement of this memo was, anyone who doesn't do this will be fired. Thank you. Have a nice day. They lit a fire under every team to rethink and redesign the services behind Amazon that powers AWS today to be more API first driven.
I love the idea of thinking that 20 years ago, this was, just a sparkle in some billionaire's eye. And look at where AWS is today, right? Like it is a foundational platform, and that vision clearly is what sparked a lot of the action and the incentives to make sure that those public APIs were available. Pull out your crystal ball, given what you know about what's happening across the technology industry, what's happening socioeconomically, societally. How do you see API product management roles changing over the next 5, 10, or you can go even further if you'd like, years?
API product management roles will be much, much more common. People want to build APIs as a company. That's going to be a startup, but also companies who are trying to catch up in the game and need a public API. The second kind of trend that I've seen is that we've talked a lot about like public APIs, but there's also internal APIs. There's a new discipline that I've seen more and more for at least bigger companies around product managers for internal APIs. And they call this developer productivity, because in bigger companies, internal APIs can be a mess. There's no common standard. The experience is terrible. If you want to be an API product manager, you can have opportunities for both being a public facing API product manager or an internal API product manager. Before, it's kind of like, I'm going to put API out there and see what happens. Companies want to invest more resources. When I was first starting out as API product manager, I was basically doing everything. But now in these like companies where they are more developer first, API first, now I have access to like product designers and research. We're actually talking to customers and getting research up front. I think API product managers will have a more prominent role. APIs are becoming more powerful. They allow much more flexibility for companies, and it's something that they cannot think about as an afterthought. Because not only do you have to think about the customer experience for a feature, but you also have to think about the developer experience. That's where companies are gravitating toward. Every product feature that rolls out, it has to roll out with a public API.
One of the things we promised at the beginning was that we would give people some top tips on how to actually land your first API PM job. And this is something that you and I both do as mentors on Pocketboard, is really helping people tell their stories and build a roadmap to the role that they really want. What are your top 3 interview success tips for landing an API product management job?
Try out the company's API. For most API product management interviews, they will ask you, what do you think of API? Put yourself in the shoes of a developer and understand, hey, is it easy to use? What are the pain points? You have to imagine yourself, okay, if I did join the company, what would I do to improve the API? And the best way to do that is just to try it out. You're not going to know everything. You're not expected to know everything during the interview, but you should at least try it out and have some initial recommendations. The second thing, you're going to be building APIs at the end of the day. In some cases, you're going to be building APIs from scratch. So a common question is, how would you design an API to request a car if you were like a car service, like an Uber or Lyft? Or design an API if you wanted to search for a list of restaurants on Google Maps? And a good way to do that is just go to the Uber API, go to the Google Maps API, go to some common APIs, look at what the basic things that they ask for in terms of inputs and requests and responses, and just kind of get a feeling of what good APIs look like and how they work. And then you can apply that when those design questions come up. The third thing is, you do not want to be throwing up buzzwords of things that you may or may not know. If you know what RESTful APIs means, if you know what HTTP means, or like get, post, patch, delete, request methods mean, go ahead and say that. But don't pretend to know, because they're going to ask you to drill down on it and ask you for more detail. So be honest, transparent on what you do know, what you don't know. And if you don't know, be honest. And you could just simply say, I'm just going to ask my developer. And that's perfectly fine. You can also demonstrate in your past experience that you can easily pick up these technical concepts. Well, those are the 3 things. Use a company's API, understand how to design an API. And the third thing is just being honest and transparent of what you know and don't know. And last but not least, the bonus tip. I've been asked this a number of times, and classic product manager question about product sense. What is your favorite product? You could get asked, what is your favorite API and why? I'll leave it at that.
I love that question. And I will also admit openly that I use that question all the time. Not the API one. I'm going to use that one now. But really, what's your favorite website and app? Because first of all, it's a great starting point for any product design, product strategy question, which are kind of canonical for product managers. But the other thing it does is it really reveals how much someone is treating their product management experience as a craft that they're trying to hone. Do they study product manager? Do they study consumer apps, marketplaces, whatever, their expertise area is? So I love the idea of transforming that canonical question into APIs and saying like, hey, tell me what your favorite API is and why you love it. Because if you're really into the craft of APIs, that will be a very easy question. And if you're not, it will be a very hard question. As I'm looking for my first API PM job, what are the key success factors that I should either look for in the job description, ask about in my interviews, or try to get internet intel on?
I think the first thing is just assessing the company itself. You want to be set up for success. If the company have a developer first mindset or philosophy, this means that as an API product manager, you are working on core products and features that is key to the success of the company. The second thing is, what other roles are they hiring to help you be set up for success? And what I mean by that is, are they hiring for like developer relations type roles, like evangelists, advocates? Are they hiring for like technical writers to build better documentation? And then last but not least, look at the company's APIs, try it yourself. So you see if it's something that you want to like build on top of it, improve it. That's kind of another gauge to see what you're getting into.
Something that's unique to APIs that's not the same for every product is the ability to just look through the changelog, trying to understand how frequently are they creating new APIs, and then also what's the balance between fixes versus new features. And I think that's actually just wise PM advice in general, like understanding the velocity of the company or product that you're trying to join. This has been a fabulous whirlwind conversation through what is an API, using this, restaurant analogy, then going into describing it from a technical perspective, talking about how to get into API product management roles. What are the success factors for the roles? What are the North Star metrics and what do you measure? A couple of things that I want to share with listeners. One is if you want to get one-on-one help from Quy, whether that's helping you understand more about API product management, whether that's getting support as you ramp up in an API product management role, or if you're looking to move your career towards API product management, getting support, thinking about a roadmap strategy, an interview strategy, and have some practice rounds in, you can find Quy on Pocketboard. I'll put the link in the description for the podcast below. And then also, Quy was really kind to do a little bit of research for anyone who is in that career discovery journey, looking to get into API product management. And I will include links that he wanted to make sure that you had access to. So thanks again, Quy.
Thanks, Erica. Happy to share my knowledge.
If you found this video helpful, please give us a like. We respond to every comment. If you want me or other Pocketboard mentors to make other helpful videos, please subscribe to our channel, ring the bell so that you always know as soon as we drop a new video. Let me actually ask that in a podcasty way.
Okay. Does Zora make a guest appearance in some of the videos?
I have a very needy dog and it makes podcasting not super easy because he wants to be held, but then I have to be so far from the camera. You're so needy.